when I was asked to speak tonight, I had a bit of a dilemma. I thought, do I spend the 7 minutes that I've got, which I'm hoping to squeeze a few more minutes if Kate will let me, in talking to you about many of the things that we've been trying to promote at the Sustainable Living Foundation for nearly 2 decades, which is this concept of accelerating the uptake of sustainability, which we all know that we desperately need to do. You know, whether it's the visions of our renewable energy and feeding that into the city and into the grid, and many of the things, obviously, that we've heard here tonight. But I want to be a little bit more provocative if I can tonight, because I think that I can't make this point that I'm trying to unless I take us a little bit into the darker side this evening. So bear with me, and I'm hoping still to keep you in the mix tonight towards the end with the positive message. I guess tonight we've heard from a range of speakers which have shared their expertise and their knowledge and their creativity. And it's because of people like this that there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Melbourne has the great potential to become an eco-city. There's a rich culture of care in this city and creativity that I think is second to none. Melbourne holds, I think, in my view, the most progressive attitudes on climate change and sustainability, and many would view that global warming is a critical issue to resolve if we're going to reach this goal of a sustainable city. I mean, example, hands up here who thinks that climate change is a critical issue for us to resolve if we're going to get on this pathway to a sustainable city. Okay, so it's pretty much all with the audience. There'll be a couple of you that we'll have a conversation with afterwards. But even though we have this immense commitment within this city, there's still something that's very troubling. And I'm very troubled, and no doubt many of you are, in terms of where things are headed. But I think it's something that we have to confront head on if we're going to imagine what this EcoMelbourne city looks like. At the moment, there is a giant mismatch between, firstly, what we care about and what we're trying to protect. Secondly, what the climate science is telling us. And lastly, what our current strategies are for getting to that end. Now, let me be clear here, I'm not talking about the difference in relation to the climate deniers or those that hold conservative views on climate change. I'm talking about a difference that exists, I think, even within the progressive movement on climate change. Let's take a look for a minute, I think if we've got the slides up, about a look at a graphic that I think that illustrates the point on the Climate Paris Agreement. It was a historic agreement which I think illustrates the point. Our world leaders came together to form an agreement to recognise the urgent need for climate action. An agreement was reached, and for many, just getting that damn agreement was hard enough in itself. This graph here shows, was taken from a recent report that was done by the Breakthrough Centre, and it was written by Ian Dunlop, a former chair of the Australian Coal Association and a risk analyst for Shell. Some of you may be familiar with his work. Here is the 1 degree of warming that we've experienced already in the last 100 years or so. And here is the warming that is already in the system that will heat up over the next coming decades, which will take us to 1.5 degrees. Now, the target that was set at Paris was 1.5 degrees of warming, with an upper limit cap of 2 degrees of warming. This agreement was, and still is today, held up by many as a great outcome. Leading scientists and businesses and governments and hundreds of environmental and climate NGOs alike have praised the agreement. Yet the Paris Agreement voluntary emissions reduction commitments, there's the 2 degrees upper limit there. If the Paris Agreement voluntary emission reduction commitments from those countries who signed up, if they were implemented today, would result in the planet warming by 3 degrees and with a 50% chance of exceeding that limit. So we've got a 1.5 to 2 degrees target, and we've got 3 to 4 degrees action outcome. Mismatch? But just hang on a minute, Luke. Just hang on. I hear you cry, or some of you maybe. The point is that this is just a starting point. It's a place that we can ratchet up the agreements over time. Well, if that is the case, then what is the stepping up plan? What are the next level policies? And when should this be implemented by if we are to achieve a 1.5 to 2 degree cap, if that's your target? At this point, some of you also might be thinking, why are you trying to lift the bar? Why are you trying to lift the bar when getting a bar was so hard enough in the first place? So even though I totally agree that the world is in absolute desperate need to get an agreement, an international agreement on climate change, surely this extremely risky situation should not be left without major critique and major intervention when the consequences for exceeding this limit are so troubling, you might say. It is impossible to design realistic solutions to our cities unless we first understand and accept the size of the problem. Just like in an emergency response, you don't want the paramedics just to turn up, to take a very quick look at you, slap a Band-Aid on your head and say, "You'll be right, mate." Our expectation is that when you're in great threat, our expectation is that we form a thorough assessment of the condition so a proper evaluation of the risks can be done. This is essential so that we can prescribe the best treatment possible and know how quickly is needed for the treatment to be administered. We activate this response in order to maximise the chances of recovery, and yet this is not our risk management approach to climate change, and obviously our very own security. Would you get on a plane if you had 50% chance of crashing? Of course you wouldn't. When we work on public safety to reduce smoking or road accidents, we don't just select one group of the population that we want to survive, and we don't underplay the impacts. We aim for maximum protection and warn people about the very real risks and present pathways forward. The inconvenient truth now is that climate change presents an existential risk to us and to our civilization. No longer can people argue that this is just an ecological problem. There's evidence that climate change is a threat multiplier and an accelerant to economic and social instability. The effects on food and water security have already led to major conflicts around the world over the past decades, as we know. Even within parts of the sustainability movement, I don't think that we're talking and leading enough with an honest enough account of the risks, and we aren't seeking targets and action that would deliver a high enough level of protection. You may hear that dangerous climate change is already locked in, despite the fact that with the right scale and speed of action, we can actually return to safe climate conditions. You may hear that the economic transitions that we're after have to be incremental, despite the fact that through all our human history, there have been examples of major economic and social mobilisations. We can look at the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, the Asian tiger economies, the Second World War economies. They're great examples of what humans can do when we think we're under great threat. Then this is not to mention all the other innovations which have taken place over our human history. The digital revolution, for example, the space race, the list goes on and on. You may also have heard that you shouldn't present the real risks and the threats to people or you'll scare them off. Despite that when when you actually talk to people about what the real risks are, along with the pathways of how to get there, most people want to know and are highly motivated to support the necessary action. As naive as it might sound to some, our cities need a transition to a new economy that is geared to negative zero-emission lifestyles as fast as humanly possible. To play its role in protecting the things we care about, EcoCity Melbourne must join with a global community to support, one, a transition to zero emissions now in order to stop adding more dangerous levels to the atmosphere, and two, to support a carbon drawdown program to deal with the dangerous levels of carbon already existing in the system. We've got the wealth, we've got the knowledge, we have this great city, and we also have unknown human potential. But we will need the will to act at the scale and speed that is actually going to protect us. Thanks very much.